We're going to cut those guys off in the 1960s. That was the Y Studs singing their evolution of Jewish music. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? Let's light up the darkness. Who is going to be with us as we get it going on the second to last night of 2020? This year can't end soon enough, right? May 2021 be less interesting and more Torah-ful than 2020 was. All right, who's with us tonight? Stephen Giger from Dover, New Hampshire, Pauline in Arkansas, Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey, Melissa in Great Neck, John in Sedona, James says shalom from Indianapolis, Paul in Chicago, Allison in Fayetteville, Renee in Indy, Michael Finkelstein in Jefferson City, Missouri. Chaim says Charlotte is in the house. Isabel says shalom. Judith in the surgery suite at Palmdale. Judith, may you have a complete and speedy recovery. And we say amen. Or if you're waiting for someone, that they should have a complete and speedy recovery. Anne says shalom from Utah. Rochelle from Modesto. Judith, anyone have a spare hip? It's good to have a sense of humor when our bodies are ailing, right? Renee liked the medley. Debbie also loved these songs. She says Shabbat and Shalom and L'chaim in the new year. Anne in Merced. Charles in San Antonio loves the Y Studs. Rochelle says amen. Anne says amen. Arnold is in the house from Northridge. Debbie says hallelujah. Hannah Rivka in Charlotte. Kathy, wait a minute, in La Mirada, California. Debbie is in Brunswick, Georgia. And Lord's Jonel Kanaya Naui says he loves the songs of the Jewish, and he's in Salt Lake City, Utah, I think. Welcome, everybody. Oh, I didn't open a window for YouTube. Let me get that going. Give me 1 second. Sorry. Okay, over there on the YouTube side, Neil in the house from Virginia and Marjorie from Georgia. Welcome, everybody. It's great to be learning with you. We have a couple of dedications tonight. Aaron and Miriam Heller, dedicating tonight's learning in living memory of Rita Goldnab. May her memory always be for a blessing. May her soul be bound up in the bonds of eternal life. We remember her and we honor her by dedicating the merit of our learning tonight to Rita. Thank you so much, Aaron and Miriam. And may you and your sons, your whole family, be showered in blessings. And we say amen. Also, a dedication from Galia Baruch. Dedication for the healing of Amalia Bat Tohar, our precious granddaughter. We should only hear good news, Galia, about Amalia Bat Tohar. She should have a complete and speedy recovery. We say amen, and may you and all your family be showered in blessings. We say amen. 1 day left in our annual campaign to score the matching funds. If you donate today or tomorrow to our annual campaign to fund this class, all the videos that we make, the table for 5 we put out each week, Nina's Thursday Heroes, all the holiday posts. This pandemic came around, so many people were isolated. And this community and our ability to learn together and to share Torah across states and even continents has become so dear to so many people. Not everyone can afford to donate, but if you can, you are supporting very important work. We have to pay our staff, our vendors, they're called predators, producer editors that we work with when we're making videos. There's marketing expense, accounting expense, legal, web design especially. growing the audience costs money. Everything that we do, unfortunately, costs money in this world, so that when you donate to us, you partner with us in lighting up the darkness. It's a great, great zechut, a great merit to you, and we hope you'll partner with us. The link is in the comments, donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. Suggested donation to dedicate one of our classes is $180. Minimum donation for that is $54. But every dollar gets doubled by our generous matchers. It's big, big impact, and we appreciate it so much. All right. Where are we holding? This is Daf Lamed. Where are we? Lamed Test. This is page 39 of Tractate 4, Pesachim, the laws of Passover, the fourth volume of the Talmud. And we're in chapter 2, and we're starting our discussion of a new Mishnah tonight. This is Mishnah number 7 in chapter 2. This one has tremendous practical application if you're Jewish, because you're, God willing, going to be at a Seder come this Passover. And, in the beginning, we were talking so much about what you can't do at Passover. The previous Mishnah, number 6, was about what kind of matzah can we fulfill our obligation to eat matzah on the first night of Passover. And today's Mishnah is with what kinds of vegetables or herbs or other substances can we fulfill our obligation to eat maror, bitter herbs. We have to eat bitter herbs on the first night of Passover. That's in Israel, outside of Israel. It's the first 2 nights. The festival is the first 2 nights. That's why we have 2 Seders, first and second Seder. And we have to eat matzah, and we have to eat bitter herb. We would have to eat the Pesach, the Paschal offering, but the temple sadly was destroyed 2,000 years ago, and so we can no longer observe that mitzvah, that obligation to eat the offering, the lamb or the goat. But the bitter herb and the matzah, yes, we are obligated to eat those. And tonight we're talking about, what counts as bitter herb? And I read this before when I made my first Daf Yomi journey, but I guess I just kind of went quickly through this. I was just reading. I wasn't studying so that I could teach it. This time around, I really whoa, that was surprising. So there's some surprises here. Let's get into our discussion of the 7th Mishnah here in chapter 2 of Tractate Pesachim on page 39. And these are the vegetables with which a person can fulfill his obligation to eat bitter herbs on Passover. One can fulfill his obligation with chazeret, and it matters that that's the first one mentioned. And we're going to get a definition of chazeret, once we get into the Gemara. But basically, chazeret is romaine lettuce. We will come back to that. With chervil, which is tamcha, and with field eringo, which is charchavina, and with endives or endives. How do you pronounce that word? Endives, endives. I don't know how to pronounce that. Which is olashin. And with maror. Now, maror is the word for bitter herbs, but it also can refer to a specific plant, which is thought by most people to refer to the common sow thistle. I don't know if you pronounce that correctly. Sow thistle, S-O-W thistle, which is a flower and a thistle that grows pretty commonly in the land of Israel. And so at least the modern sages are saying that is probably, when we talk about maror as a specific plant, it's this common sow thistle, but it also refers to the category of bitter herbs. One fulfills his obligation with them, whether they are fresh or whether they are dry. However, one does not fulfill his obligation if they are pickled in water or vinegar, nor if they are overboiled, shaluk, in hot water, nor if they are boiled, mevushal. The Mishnah adds, and all these different types of vegetables join together to the measure of a ketzayis, an olive bulk. i.e., it is not necessary to eat the minimum measure and an olive's volume worth of the vegetable. You don't have to eat it all from one type of this vegetable. You can combine these different vegetables. That's why I say it's a category. And one fulfills his obligation by eating their stalk. Now, I got a note earlier today from Neil who said, wait a minute, we eat horseradish at Passover, and we're going to be talking about horseradish, but we don't eat the stalk, we eat the root. Are we doing it wrong? Are we not fulfilling our obligation? But really the way that this is read is that one fulfills his obligation even by eating the stalk. It is not necessary to eat the leaves, and the root kind of comes along and gets included in that understanding of it. As it is not necessary to eat the leaves. And one fulfills the obligation with demai, doubtfully tithed produce, with Meiser Rishon, with first tithe produce, whose teruma has been taken and given to a priest, and with both Meiser Sheni, second tithe produce, and consecrated property, if they were properly redeemed, so that they could be used to fulfill our obligation of eating maror on Pesach. All right, so that's so the second paragraph was about their status in terms of tithing. The first paragraph is identifying the vegetables that will count to fulfill our obligation to eat maror, to eat bitter herbs on the first night of Passover. So the first few paragraphs of the Gemara are going to be sort of getting into the Aramaic translations of these vegetables and which vegetables count and which ones don't. And then we're going to pick up the flow of the discussion, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, on the sixth paragraph down. And they're not really paragraphs, that's how the Koran is breaking it up, but sort of six, little, not sentences necessarily, but sort of 6 units of learning into the Gemara. And Rabbi Yehuda says, any plant that has white sap when it is cut may be used as bitter herbs. Rabbi Yochanan ben Baraka says, anything whose surface is light green may be used as bitter herbs. Acherim say, any bitter herb that has sap and whose surface is light green is fit for this mitzvah. Rabbi Yochanan said, from the statements of all these sages, we can learn that a bitter green herb has sap and its surface is light green. And Rav Huna said, the halacha, the law, is in accordance with the opinion of Acherim. Acherim say, any bitter herb that has sap and whose surface is light green is fit for this mitzvah. We learned some months ago that Acherim, others say, generally refers to Rabbi Meir, and he was penalized that some of his rulings, instead of being placed into the Gemara in his name, are listed as others say. And that's because he got into some political hot water with the Nasi in his generation. Ravina found Rav Acha, the son of Rava, searching for merirata to use as bitter herbs. Merirata? Do we have a description of what is merirata here? Hold on a second. I'm not seeing that. But the point is that it's very bitter. Okay? So Ravina found Rav Acha, the son of Rava, searching for this one herb. Oh, wait a minute. Here it is. Searching for merirata. Some commentaries explain that Rav Acha, the son of Rava, was searching for the bitterest of the herbs listed in the Mishna. Right? So he was looking for something really bitter to eat for this, fulfilling this obligation to eat bitter herbs on the first night. And by the way, why do we eat bitter herbs on the first night? Because the Torah says so. This is a God-given commandment that we have to eat bitter herbs on the first night of Passover. But what is it that we're remembering is the bitterness of slavery in Egypt. And so Rav Acha, the son of Rava, was searching for merirata, and Ravina said to him, what is your opinion what is your opinion that you seek this particular herb? If you are looking for that which is most bitter, but we learned Nazirite first in the Mishna, which indicates that this is the preferred choice. And likewise, a sage of the school of Shmuel taught chazeret first, before the other types of bitter herbs. And Rabbi Oshaya said the optimal fulfillment of the mitzvah is with chazeret. And Rava said, what is chazeret? And it is lettuce, or in Aramaic, chasa. Now, I don't know about you, but I grew up in a non-Orthodox home, but pretty traditional, right? Jewish family on both sides, Ashkenazic. My father's family, it was my great-grandfather who left Ukraine and went to Chile. My mother's family, they're Hungarian. My mother herself was born in Hungary, but they're Hungarian Jews going back many generations. And in my home, eating the bitter herb on Passover, at this Passover Seder, was always accomplished with horseradish, with white horseradish, raw horseradish. They would actually cut it 2 different ways, just sort of cut little pieces that you could actually chew, and they would also grate it, so that it'd be a little bit easier to place on the matzah to make a little bit of a matzah sandwich with the maror, with the bitter herb. And sometimes we would add the haroset, which is sweet, to that sandwich. But when we're eating the bitter herb, like if it's not cleaning out your sinuses, you didn't have enough bitter herb. And there would always be jokes at our Seder table that, if somebody, got themselves into trouble in the past year, so then as a kind of atonement, this is totally unofficial, there's no halacha of this at all, this is no legal requirement, but just in our family, if you were thought to be a troublemaker, then you should eat an extra big portion of the white horseradish because it's strongly, strongly bitter. And then later, as an adult, when I was making my own home, we got our own, actually it was an important wedding gift for me and Nina, was a Seder plate. Our friend Stephanie Adwar gave us a Seder plate for our wedding. And there's 6 locations on there of sort of the symbolic foods of Passover. And one of them is this chazeret, right, which is lettuce. And I was always a little bit puzzled by it. I looked it up. I didn't research it thoroughly. But, just in growing up, like we didn't have lettuce on our Seder plate. And I didn't really understand the point of the lettuce. But now I see it. Now, most modern Seder plates have a spot both for chazeret and for maror. So like there's bitter herb and chazeret. But the chazeret, you eat it to satisfy your obligation to eat maror, to eat bitter herbs. And right here, we're hearing why, right? Because why we're supposed to do it now? Because the sages of the Mishna listed chazeret first, meaning that this is the optimal way to satisfy one's obligation to eat bitter herbs at Passover, at the Seder. And I'm like, my head's exploding. Because, romaine lettuce, which is the kind of lettuce that's meant here, I wouldn't call it a sugary confection. But bitter? It's not really bitter. It's just kind of bland, And it was such a big deal to eat, we got to suffer. You got to eat the bitter herb that is truly bitter. So when did that tradition change? And or did my family just go off the rails, or what's going on here? But I understand that my family's not the only one. There's so many families that have that horseradish. So what's the horseradish all about? And when did it become the horseradish rather than the lettuce? Well, part of that story is as simple as when we lived in a Mediterranean climate in the Holy Land, or in Bavel, right, in the Babylonian Empire, which became part of the Persian Empire, nice warm place. Okay, so lettuce was pretty easily available. Once the Jews made their way into Northern Europe, medieval times, yet lettuce not so readily available in the springtime, at the time of Passover. Very often, by the time they would get romaine lettuce, it was mealy and dirty and full of bugs and not kosher for that reason, and very problematic. Whereas, of course, a root, like a horseradish root, travels very well. It lasts a long time. You just scrape off the outside. You got the clean inner layer, and it made more sense. So it was not the optimal way to fulfill your obligation to eat bitter herb, but it made sense in that time and place. So now today, where we live in such a world that we can have, romaine lettuce quite fresh any time of the year, should we think about going back to chazeret for our bitter herb? Or should we keep going this minhag, this tradition, this custom that came about in European Jewry to eat the horseradish? I'm not answering the question, but it's something to think about. And maybe that's why so often modern Seder plates have spots for both the chazeret and the bitter herb. But why is it that chazeret is optimal? Why, if we're commanded to eat a bitter herb, why romaine lettuce, which is not really that bitter at all? And the Gemara explains, so what is the meaning of lettuce, of chasa? It refers to the fact that God has mercy on us. And Rabbi Samuel Bar Nachmani said that Rabbi Yochanan said, why are the Egyptians likened to bitter herbs in the verse? This is Exodus 1:14, and they embittered our lives. This comparison serves to tell you that just as these bitter herbs are soft at first and harsh in the end, so too the Egyptians were soft at first when they paid the Jews for their work, but were harsh in the end when they enslaved them. And this idea applies solely to chazeret, which has a bitter aftertaste, but not to the other types of bitter herbs, which are bitter from the beginning. Rav Acha, the son of Rava, said to Ravina, I retract my position and concede that it is preferable to use chazeret for bitter herbs, preferable to a super bitter herb. And Rav Rechumi said to Abaye, from where is it known that this bitter herb must be eaten at night, that must be eaten on Passover night, is a type of vegetable? So actually, we're going to go on, before I go to that paragraph, now I'm about to teach that it needs to be a vegetable and not some other substance that is bitter. But a couple of notes. First of all, we have a note here that the Egyptians were soft at first. In this context, many commentaries cite an exposition in the Yerushalmi, excuse me, in the Yerushalmi, on the verse that the Egyptians enslaved the Israelites with rigor at Exodus 1:14. In the Jerusalem Talmud, it is explained that initially the Egyptians controlled the Israelites with a soft mouth, but eventually they enslaved them with rigorous labors. In terms of the progression of the exile itself, this can be explained as a reference to the fact that initially, when Jacob and his family went into Egypt, Pharaoh said to Joseph, let your brothers dwell in the best of the land, and then later the Egyptians enslaved the Jewish people. Okay. And what is the law on this subject? The optimal fulfillment of the mitzvah is with chazeret. One should preferably use chazeret for bitter herbs. In many European communities, lettuce was uncommon and was infested with worms, and therefore became customary to use horseradish. Based on Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, some people use both horseradish and lettuce. So there, it's a mystical practice. If you have both chazeret and horseradish, and you eat both in order to fulfill your obligation to eat bitter herbs on that first night of Passover, the first 2 nights outside Israel, now you're fulfilling a mystical aspect of this obligation. Let's continue. Rav Rechumi said to Abaye, and Nina, if you're hearing me, could you bring me a tissue, honey? I'm sorry, I should have one in reach, but I don't. Okay. Where am I? Rav Rechumi said to Abaye, from where is it known that this bitter herb that must be eaten on Passover night is a type of vegetable? Perhaps one could say that the mitzvah could be performed with the bile of a kufia fish, which is very bitter. but not necessarily with a type of plant. And he answered, bitter herbs are similar to matzah. Thank you so much, honey. I appreciate it. As we say in the movies, tissues flying in. Okay. So the question is, why can't we eat it with just a bitter food? Why does it have to be from a plant? The bile of this kufia fish is very bitter. Could we fulfill our obligation with that? And so Abaye is answering, and he says, bitter herbs are similar to matzah. Just as matzah must be prepared only from food that grows from the ground, so too bitter herbs must be from food that grows from the ground. And the Gemara asks, well, how do we know that a bitter herb is specifically a vegetable rather than the bitter oleander bush? And the Gemara answers, bitter herbs are similar to matzah. Just as matzah is prepared from a type of plant, not including a tree, so too bitter herbs must be from a type of plant that is not a tree. Rabba bar Rav Chanin said to Abaye, well, I can say that the bitter herb mentioned in the Torah includes merely one species, i.e. there's only the bitterest plant can be used for this obligation. Abaye responded, for this reason, it is written in Exodus 12:8, merorim, bitter herbs, plural. In the plural, indicating that many types of bitter herbs are fit for this purpose. Rabba retorted, but one can say that bitter herbs refers to two different species, but no more. And Abaye answered, bitter herbs are similar to matzah. Just as matzah can be prepared from many types of grain, so too bitter herbs can be taken from many different types of vegetables. Right. Then I'm going to skip down toward the end of 39b. The Mishna taught that one can fulfill his obligation to eat bitter herbs with these types of vegetables, whether they are fresh or whether they are dried. Rav Chisda said they taught this halacha only with regard to the stem. However, with regard to the leaves, if they are moist, yes, they may be used as bitter herbs, but if they are dry, no, they may not serve as bitter herbs. With regard to the stems and leaves of maror, the law is one may use the leaves of bitter herbs only when they are fresh, but the stems may be used even as they are dry, as stated by Rav Chisda. And now I'm actually coming to the end. It's going to be a short class tonight, so if you've got questions and comments, please put them in. So the Gemara raises an objection from a Baraisa. One can fulfill the obligation with the bitter herbs themselves or with their stems, whether they are fresh or whether they are dried. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. And the rabbis say, with regard to fresh bitter herbs, one can fulfill his obligation with them. However, with regard to dry bitter herbs, one cannot fulfill the obligation with them, and everyone agrees that one can fulfill his obligation with them if they are withered and are no longer fresh. However, one may neither use bitter herbs that have been pickled, nor overboiled, nor boiled. And the Baraisa continues, the principle is anything that has the taste of bitter herbs, one can fulfill his obligation with it, but anything that does not have the taste of bitter herbs, one cannot fulfill his obligation with it, given, of course, that it's a plant and not, some kind of matter from an animal product. It has to come from a plant and not from a tree and not from an animal, but something that grows out of the ground like a plant. And it has to have this bitter taste. But chazeret, right, lettuce doesn't have such a bitter taste, but it does have a bitter aftertaste. And also, I didn't read it here, but I read a note elsewhere about the lettuce, that an actual romaine lettuce plant, if you just let it grow and don't, pick it to sell it in the supermarket, but just let it keep growing. So romaine lettuce can get quite large. I mean, it can get like 3 feet tall, and then it will send up some flowers, and then the leaves of the flower of romaine lettuce, those are bitter indeed. So it's a different way to get at it. One way is to say that romaine lettuce has a bitter aftertaste. and others that if you let it keep growing for a long time, eventually it will produce a flower and these small, very bitter leaves. In both cases, unlike horseradish, which is the same taste all the way along, as it were, bitter from the start, the romaine lettuce is better as a symbolic food for Passover because it's not so bitter at first, and then it grows more bitter. Even though it doesn't get to a very bitter level, that idea that it's more bitter later is more reminiscent of our experience, the Jewish people's experience in Egypt, in slavery in Egypt. Okay, and this baraisa indicates that neither Rabbi Meir nor the rabbis distinguish between the leaves of these herbs and their stems. And the Gemara answers, interpret Rabbi Meir's statement that one can fulfill the obligation with both fresh and dried bitter herbs as referring to the stem but not the leaves. And the sages taught one cannot fulfill the obligation with them when they are withered. They said in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, son of Reb Tzadok, one can fulfill his obligation with them when they are withered. So the key really is it going to carry that bitter taste? If the leaves have dried out, then perhaps that taste is not going to be strong enough. It's not going to be suitable for fulfilling the obligation. And final word on this Mishnah. And this Mishnah is kind of the discussion of it is short. Tomorrow we're going to start with a new Mishnah, Mishnah number 8. So the final word in terms of the law of this Mishnah, vegetables that can be used as bitter herbs, one can fulfill the obligation to eat bitter herbs with chazeret, romaine lettuce, chervil, or any of the other species listed in the Mishnah. If none of these is available, then he should use some other type of bitter herb. However, the later authorities agree that in this case he should not recite the blessing that we're commanded to eat the bitter herb. It is preferable to use a species listed earlier in the list of vegetables in the Mishnah. One can eat the leaves or the stems, but not the roots. At least of these plants. And furthermore, one may eat either fresh leaves or dry stems, but the herbs may not be pickled or boiled. So this is interesting. So it says one can eat the leaves or the stems, but not the roots. But we already saw that the law is that, we saw it on the next page, the note of halacha, of law, one should preferably use chazeret. In many European communities, however, lettuce was uncommon and infested with worms, and therefore it became customary to use horseradish. So we definitely are okay using horseradish, but it is preferable to use the leaves or stems of the plants listed in the Mishnah. And the first plant is the most optimal, and that is romaine lettuce. So we really learned something new tonight. If you didn't know that before, that could affect your next Seder. Let me check comments and questions. Okay, hold on a second. Do I need to sign in again? Here it comes. Okay. Andrea Merlin, same experience here with horseradish rather than lettuce in my family. And Bill Eldridge says, so would this, a bitter herb is any light green veggie with sap, mean that cabbage and other brassica are acceptable, such as, for instance, Brussels sprouts? So you must have asked that question before I came back around to read the halakha. So it could be some bitter tasting vegetable that's not on that list, but it's definitely preferable not to do that, because if it's not on the list, we're not sure that we can say the bracha, the blessing, when we fulfill our obligation. We would have fulfilled our obligation with some bitter tasting vegetable, but if it's not on the list, we may not be able to say the blessing, say the bracha when we fulfill our obligation. I read a nice story. Today I get that daily email, the daily Daf Yomi email from My Jewish Learning. And I believe the writer's name was Rachel Scheinerman, I think is her name. She has a PhD in rabbinic literature, I believe from Yale. And she was telling a story of a civil war, a Seder during the American Civil War. Right, so the soldiers were way out, somewhere during one of the campaigns. I'm pretty sure she was talking about Union soldiers. Certainly there were Jewish soldiers on both sides of the war. And they were making the best, making do the best they could when they were celebrating this Passover Seder far from home. They didn't have wine, so they were drinking cider. They didn't have romaine or horseradish available, so they found some local plant that they were told was bitter, and it was super bitter and also spicy. It was some kind of bitter and spicy plant that they chose to eat. I don't think it was specified in the story. But because it was so bitter and spicy, they ended up drinking a lot more of that cider. And so the fellow who's writing it in very colorful, 1860s language said that, well, one fellow thought he was Moses, another fellow thought he was Aaron, and one fellow even thought he was Pharaoh and started speaking in the character, as it were. But eventually, they drank enough cider that they passed out, and then, a little bit of calm and order returned to the Seder when those three, got up from the table, as it were. But I want to read that account firsthand, and maybe we'll get a hold of it and share it as we get closer to Passover. A lot of these issues are touched on in a highly comedic way in the movie that Nina and I wrote and that I directed, Passover cult classic, When Do We Eat? A lot of people around the world just watch the movie in the weeks leading up to Passover. Very dysfunctional family comedy. We made it earlier in our spiritual journey, so even though there's a lot of Torah and Hasidus in it, it's also rated R. It's not for all family members. We might have been a little tamer if we made it later, when we were a little bit older, more mature. But it's filled with Torah and beautiful teachings of Yiddishkeit, as well as raucous comedy. And that movie's called When Do We Eat? And if you're curious about it, it's on Amazon Prime and Apple Movies and several other platforms. Arnold Alban says, celery and leaves of celery are better. I wonder if celery works. Now, we did have celery on the Seder plate growing up. There was a reason for the celery. I think it was a delivery vehicle for the charoset. But it was not there for the purpose of being the bitter herb, right? So when we had celery on the plate, I think it was kind of there for a similar reason as the parsley, which we eat, which is the first thing that we eat, and we say a blessing on the karpas, right, the vegetable. He said bitter, not better. He said celery and leaves of celery are bitter. And I wonder if celery works. I see. But I don't think it counts as the bitter herb. Like I said, we had celery on our plate, but it was not there to be the bitter herb. I'm not sure that this would count. But maybe if that's all you can get, but probably you wouldn't be saying the blessing over it if you're fulfilling with celery. John says, we all eat horseradish at our Seder. It becomes a competition between my teenage boys. Who is más macho? I like that. And I think there was a little bit of that going on in my house growing up as well. We were two boys, and it's possible that was going on there too. Charles Abraham Ramirez Verdugo asks, why is there flexibility to use horseradish or lettuce, but during Sukkot, one can only use esrog and not another citrus like lemons? Fantastic question. This one has a pretty simple answer because it's specified, right? Because it's specified. It doesn't say a general category. The sages derived that what's meant there is not just any citrus fruit. It's not a lemon-like fruit. It is the esrog, right? It is that particular fruit that is specified in the Torah for Sukkot. But when we're talking about bitter herbs, it just says bitter herbs, right? And it's not derived that is a specific plant. And as we learned tonight, that's why it says marorim in one of those verses, meaning not just bitter herb, but bitter herbs, plural, which means that, there are many types with which we can fulfill the obligation, just as we can make matzah from wheat or barley, rye, oats, or spelt. Bitter herbs can be taken from a lot of these different bitter vegetables, but not all of them, right? And that's why we seem to see that the rabbis of the Mishna specified these work, others don't. or others are much less optimal. And so that's why it seems to be that the law has become that if you use one of the plants on the list, you can say the blessing when you fulfill, and not on the list, you don't say the blessing. All right, that's what I've got for us tonight. If you enjoy the learning, the inspiration, the community of the Accidental Talmudist platform, then please donate to our nonprofit. There's just one day left in our annual campaign where your donations are going to be matched by our generous matchers. So to trigger that match, donate today or tomorrow before midnight on New Year's Eve. That's midnight Pacific time. But why wait? Do it now. We got to get there. We got to make it to our goal or as close as humanly possible. All the best to you, my holy sisters and brothers. That link for donating is donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. It's in the comments. And sending you all a big warm hug and our best wishes for a joy-filled New Year's Eve and a less interesting but more meaningful and Torah-full 2021 than we had in 2020. All the best.